we will finish with a bang. And I don't mean to put too much pressure on our next group, but this is what I have been looking forward to all day. And so for our debaters, you weren't here earlier this morning, but I said that this was going to be probably the best group performing today. So there's really no pressure on you. I'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Tom Corr. You have his information in your package, but the key thing is he's the President and CEO of the Ontario Centres of Excellence, and they've been tremendous in supporting new companies and developing the university private sector interactions, as well as seeing a lot of companies move forward from just ideas to reality. So Tom, come up and moderate your debate.
So thank you very much, John. So momentarily I'm going to call our panel members up, and hopefully we'll have a nice robust debate, as John suggested. Just to kick it off, just to make a few introductions and give you a little history on what we're all about. So I think we've got a great panel with representatives from both public and private sector for today's discussion. And I think everyone would agree that the subject matter very much lends itself to some very animated debate. So the subject, as you know, is, does corporate policy align or conflict with public policy? The fact is, there are some very real challenges inherent in the relationship between public policy and the development of life sciences businesses. And this is having a detrimental impact on productivity and our commercialization track record. I'm pleased to be your moderator today. As Jason pointed out to me earlier, I'm probably a good candidate to act in the role of Switzerland for this discussion. As president of OCE, the essence of our mandate is bridging the gap between industry and academia and government. And as a result, we have a unique vantage point. Through our dealings with startups, large established companies, researchers, and all levels of government, we come to see all sides of the issue. There's a lot to be gained in bringing various perspectives together, as we have done today. This can be an opportunity to air some of the issues related to trust, questions about motivations behind government decision-making, miscommunication, and territoriality, to name a few. Just as important, this is a chance to identify how we can work together to advance approaches and policies that strengthen Ontario's life sciences sector. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to quickly tell you about a recent initiative of OCE's that I believe speaks directly to this potential for shared success. In partnership with CQDM, Life Sciences Ontario, Biopolis, Quebec, OCE is bringing together a life sciences companies and researchers from the Ontario-Quebec Life Sciences Corridor to collaborate in developing innovative tools and technologies that accelerate the drug discovery process. These are the research tools or enabling technologies that help make the discovery process more efficient and hopefully easier for drugs to reach the market. OCE is doing this through our new collaboration voucher program, which we manage on behalf of the province of Ontario. Our voucher for Industry Association R&D Challenge, often referred to as the VIA voucher, is specifically designed to connect industry associations or groups of companies to address sector-wide research development challenges. In this case, the aim is to commercialize new technologies that will have significant economic impact for both provinces. This collaborative approach will benefit companies in both Ontario and Quebec. By enabling the two provinces to build on their own individual research strengths to increase innovation, productivity, and job creation. This is proving to be a very productive partnership and a good example of the importance of finding ways to work together to make things happen to the benefit of all. So if I may call up my panelists, please, and we'll get underway. I guess.
Are you going to take the green chair in the middle?
I will take whatever chair is left over.
Okay, why don't we do this on your side? You can have the nice green chair.
I like this idea that we're sitting, I don't have to stand.
I know, I know. Is everybody comfortable? It's like musical chairs. I won't introduce you to sit down so I can know where you are. There we go. So I think you know these folks, so I'm going to give a real quick introduction. On my immediate left is my friend Alan Odette. Alan is so old that he and I actually did our MBAs at U of T 1 year apart. That's how old Alan is. And you can just imagine, you know. But I started a little younger than he did, but there you go. So anyway, Alan is the president and CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, the voice of 60,000 businesses from across Ontario. Prior to joining the OCC, he was the Director of External Relations and National Private Markets for GlaxoSmithKline Canada, Inc. He has more than 25 years' experience in the biopharmaceutical industry. Alan is active on the boards of Life Sciences Ontario, Master of Biotechnology Program at the University of Toronto, and the Markham Stouffville Hospital, where he is a board director. He also serves on the Civic Action Steering Committee. And next to him is my friend Maurice Petran. Maurice is the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Integrated Environment Policy Division at the Ontario Ministry of Environment. Previously, he was a 2012-2013 Ontario Visiting Fellow in Residence at the School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto. Previously as an ADM in the Ontario government, Maurice set up and head of the Secretariat to the Premier's Jobs and Prosperity Council, led the Strategic Policy Division at the Ministry of Economic Development and Innovation, and was Ontario's chief negotiator for the free trade negotiations between Canada and the European Union. He received the Public Service Award from Life Sciences Ontario in 2013. Sandra Pupatello, who is a stranger to nobody in this room, is the Director of Business Development and Global Markets for PwC Ontario. She was first elected to the Ontario Legislature in 1995, appointed to Cabinet in 2003, and was a candidate in the 2013 Ontario Liberal leadership election. She has served in the Cabinet as Minister of Economic Development and Trade, Minister of Education, and Minister of Social Services. Sandra spent the last year serving with the federal government, reviewing Canada's aerospace industry and its worldwide competitiveness. Sandra is also the CEO of the Economic Development Corporation of Windsor, Essex, and Southern Ontario, and a member of the Hydro One Board of Governors. And Peter van der Velden is a Managing General Partner of Lemire Capital Investment Management, Inc., one of Canada's largest venture capital investment funds. His previous experience includes President and CEO of MDS Capital, Canada's oldest and largest life sciences and dedicated venture capital firm, and co-founder of Fusion Capital, a boutique investment bank targeting Canadian technology-centric businesses. He has also held positions of managing partner and head of the investment banking for technology investment bank Taurus Capital, partner of the private equity boutique Bedford Capital, and vice president business development at Heil Pharmaceuticals. So today's discussion will hopefully bring to light some of the best routes forward for strengthening the life sciences sector and its economic impact. This discussion is also intended to facilitate policy recommendations for government. So I'm just going to stand here and make it easier to see everybody and start asking some questions. And as we get into it, we've certainly got lots of time at the end left over to take questions from yourselves. So let me start with my friend Alan, and we'll just go down the row on these various questions. So if you had to, Alan, point to where there is the largest misalignment, or better, a lack of understanding between public and private sectors when it comes to life sciences policy development, what would it be?
Let's see, that's the
I saved the hard ones for Alan.
$100 question,
You
isn't
go back
it?
way
Do you
back.
know, the reality is, I think where there's misalignment is that industry may not well understand what government is capable of doing or not capable of doing. And for the most part, government's role really ought to be one of enabling and providing a framework or an environment to do some things. And industry really does not understand how government works. And I think on another level that is sort of reciprocal. The misalignment sometimes just has to do with timing and expectation, that neither one of them at times takes enough time to fundamentally understand what the other is really attempting to do. And somewhere in the course of the night, they seem to miss each other. If they were to step back and take a little bit more time to do some planning together, it'd be, I think, shocking what the net result or impact of that might be. Sandra may have some different thoughts. I expect that there won't be a great deal of misalignment among the four of us here on any of that.
Okay, Maurice, you're on the other side of this question, so what's your views on this?
So I think that Alan is right. It's been kind of a lack of understanding of each other's roles. And if I go back a few years when I was working in the Challenge Fund and trying to bring research and government and private sector together, and many scientists told me the problem is that government and politicians don't understand science. I said, well, that's only half of the problem. The other half is that scientists don't understand now how government works and how politics works. I think we've come a long way from that, but there is more to be done in this front. So sessions like this to enhance that understanding, I think are very important. There is some basic differences, right? So policy, politics, public, they're all about the collective, about everybody. And private enterprise is by definition, well, private. And so they look after different things and they have different responsibilities. As Alan said, the government should set the framework, a fair taxation system, fair regulation system, open markets where companies can sell and buy their products. And private sector is the dynamic factor in the economy, and they need to be looking for opportunities, and government needs to facilitate the development of those opportunities. I'll leave it at that, and I'll ask my former boss, Mrs. Sandra Patel. I have to say, I think she's one of the greatest ministers we've had, and she understands business really well. It was always a challenge to brief her because she always knew more than we did. And also I have to say that she's the most fun minister I've ever worked for. And I've been in the public service for 25 years.
That's nice. I'm believing only a little bit because he doesn't really work with me anymore. So anyway, that's very kind of you. And I wanted to see what you would say about Maurice's role with CETA, because I noticed you said chief negotiator. We used to call him the king of CETA because he represented the Ontario arm of that, and actually from the very early days. So we did an awful lot of work together with lots of challenges, and this sector in particular knows the challenge of the EU discussions. First of all, it's really nice to see some of you again. All of you, I just haven't seen all of you, but it's nice to see all of you again. And I do miss some parts of my old job. Not all of it, just some of it, but some of it certainly is interacting with some terrific businesses. And this sector had some very good ones that did a lot of things for Ontario. I think being an ex also gives me a little bit of license to say things in a way that might be a little more plain speaking, if I wasn't enough before, that the goal that a company has is a different goal from what the government has. And it's been said in now 2 different ways, so I'm going to be impressed when the money guy says something next about the same subject matter, and that is if business people understood, they do so much work on customer research. I always think that businesses would do as much work on government research before they walked into the door to say, well, I wonder what government's goal is in this discussion with me as a business. One, you need to be seen to be talking to business. So government needs to be seen to be talking to business because that's a good thing. And 2, we need these businesses to invest in our province. We need them to create jobs. So it isn't just invest for the sake of investing, it's a particular end. So every time you have a conversation, you start with what do they need to hear that works for their goal. It would be a very different conversation than the one that typically came before me in the boardroom at Economic Development and Trade. And I always marveled at that because I think fundamentally if you did as much work on that meeting as you do for your biggest customer that you're trying to sell to, you would know this. And I find that it really is a lack of information out there in the private sector as to what goal a government has to achieve on multiple levels. So if it's a local community and you want to talk about an investment in something virtual that probably won't pay any property taxes, there's probably a lot less interest in your expansion than if you were talking about a brand new building with multiple, thousands of square footage. So that just seems so obvious, but it's only obvious once you've been on both sides, which I think is interesting that you need some people straddling both. And fortunately, I think there are a lot of people if we would take the time to reach out to them. But I'll stop there because I think that one question was the core of the whole debate, and Alan kind of took the shine off the rest of us with his first answer.
I've been doing
I'll
that for
stop.
years.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sam.
So I'll pick up exactly where everyone else has left off. I think timing and expectations are the two misalignments. And I think the hardest one probably is understanding that we are going to go through failure before we go through success. And for a politician, that's not a positive thing, right? You can't adopt a program, put in place a policy, and then have the expectation that failure is going to be part of that policy. But when I build a venture portfolio, I fully expect 25% of my portfolio to fail. And so this concept of lemons ripen first, which is what the venture capital business is really all about, is very misaligned with policy objectives around how do I get elected the next time voters have to think about what I've accomplished on my mandate. So I think that's a real challenge. I think the other challenge is understanding that what we do in our domain isn't like what happens in other domains within the venture capital ecosystem. It is, the timeframes are just fundamentally different. It is just far longer to build the kind of companies that we want to build. It is fundamentally more expensive. We need fundamentally more lines of resource. So if you're thinking about building an IT company, you're not likely to do licensing deals with pharma partners. You're not likely to have big NIH grants or NRC grants. You're not likely to have to engage this much broader ecosystem. And so when the government thinks about how they build an ITC company or how they put in place policy to enable an ITC company, it can't be one brush suits all, because what we do is so fundamentally different. And I think that's the biggest challenge in misalignment there.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So Alan, if I can come back to you. So we've talked about some of the challenges, getting people aligned in the sector. So what do you think is working well, if anything, especially as it pertains to life sciences and government involvement?
I think it picks up a little bit more back on the whole misalignment thing, and there's large enterprise. So there's the big firms, the Glaxos and the Bears and these sorts of firms, and in some cases, some of these firms have lost control of their balance sheet here, and so there's an alignment there of what they need to do. Those general managers going back to mothership to get things. And then you have medium enterprise, which has a certain set of objectives. And then the small biotech or firms that are emerging. There's three different unique and distinct things that are going on there. And one area that seems to be working well is the earlier stage. The smaller firms seem to be doing fairly well, but then we're not able to bridge the gap from there to commercialization, and we don't seem to be that effective at leveraging our procurement system for the benefit of the large enterprise. And so I think that's maybe a snapshot into some things that are working well, and maybe areas where we could be significantly more effective if we could understand how we might leverage the power and strength of government to support it. I've been having a number of discussions with large enterprise, primarily insurance firms and banks, that because of their own bureaucracies, they're not doing a very good job at procuring through small enterprise. Well, the government is doing the same thing. It's really not thinking about the power and strength of procurement to drive economic development and growth in the province. So, I suppose that's a bit of a snapshot in what I see in this sector. I don't think is different than some others,
Okay.
but it has its own unique set of challenges.
Maurice, look forward to your comments.
Well,
Thank
I
you.
think that we have a number of clusters that would be the envy of just about any other country. And so there are areas of the economy that are doing well, where I think government is being able to put the framework conditions in place, harmonizing the GST, for example, opening new markets, etc. And private sector has taken on the challenge and done very well. So. And there's some new ones like the animation area and even life sciences as well. Can we do better? Of course. Are there challenges? Of course. But by and large, I think it's a matter of aligning the objectives a bit better, understanding each other's functions a bit better. But I don't think there's anything drastically wrong with the way things are.
Thank you. Sandra?
Well, I thought maybe a good example of what did happen that I'm aware of, we created this secretariat called Open for Business, which seems like such a cliche. Ultimately, no one wants to talk about process because it's boring, but process really mattered in how we would collect the right people at the table to solve problems for business and cut through regulatory issues, et cetera, in the government to allow businesses to grow. So everybody says that. They've been saying it for decades, and I was a little frustrated to be handed this mandate in that ministry. So we spent some time at the front end deciding that the process has to change, and we would go across the government so that companies didn't have to. And in one room we put, and we did this by sector, and one that worked, which became the genesis for the notions around the procurement piece that you announced earlier with the medical devices group. We put the cluster representatives in the room on one side of the table where I sat with the business side, and then on the other side we brought deputies from every ministry of the Government of Ontario that touched that cluster. So if it was the agriculture people, we brought in Ministry of the Environment deputy, the Ministry of Natural Resources deputy, MTO, surprisingly, how farm equipment can't traverse a road when it needs to, all these things. So all the deputies were in there all at the same time. So this is kind of historic because they managed to craft a meeting every now and then with any one of them, but it's like telephone with the string, the can that you put on one end, and then you would play a game as a kid and how the story changed with each child telling the story. I found life is like that as well. Every time the story would change, the third ministry didn't really understand what the initial discussion was about the problem. So doing it all at once, all at the same table, and everyone accountable, we would kick off each sector by making the premier asking the premier to attend the opening session. So all his deputies now saw this is a government imperative. And we would turn this dial over and say we have 60 days to come back with a resolution. And it was a phenomenal process because everyone could hear the story of the problem, and you couldn't change or translate that in any other way but what we all heard at the same time. So as much as process is boring and no one likes to talk about that, it really matters. So I would say that as companies complain about government being unresponsive, likewise, companies don't want to be creative in advancing some solutions in how they expect the government to help them. And I think, I'm not going to be a government apologist. I did that for 8 of the 16 years. But I know that now on the other side, sitting, whether it's at PricewaterhouseCoopers, on the business side of things, I know that businesses, what they're prepared to do for their clients, they're not prepared to do for the government. And they should consider the government to be their client, their customer, whatever, and expend as much resource to prepare for working with that stakeholder.
Okay, thank you. Peter.
Yeah, so I'll wear my CBCA hat really to answer part of this question because that's really the only context in which I have a policy view. So what's working well, I think, the CBCA has figured out how to talk to government at least about some things, and I think we've been very engaged in the venture capital process with the government over the last 2 years. And one of the things we focused on, frankly, is talking about jobs. It is an issue for every politician. How do we engage people in the work environment, people coming out of the university, people who are going through job transitions? And what we've been able to demonstrate through a lot of research is that venture capital companies and the companies that we fund create a lot of jobs. They create a disproportionate jobs for the dollars invested. They can create those jobs disproportionately quickly, and people who are in those jobs make disproportionately more than people in comparable jobs that aren't venture-backed. So it's a message that resonates. I think the governments have shown engagement on that topic. We've seen the federal government put in place the Venture Capital Action Plan, $400 million of new capital for the ecosystem. And I think they're doing something very smart, which is they're trying to pair that up with non-government money to engage others in the ecosystem. I think it's smart to use that kind of leverage. So they take their $400 million, hopefully get $1 billion. I think that's an engaged, thoughtful process of coming at the problem. We've seen the provincial governments do the same thing. The Ontario government here set up the Ontario Venture Capital Fund, did the same thing, $90 million of their money, 210 or $205 million ultimately in the fund. So they leveraged a fair amount of other people's money. So I think that that's really important. There are some things that are unintended consequences. I heard about harmonizing HST. Well, that's a disaster for my industry. I now get charged fees on my management fees, and no one else in the world gets those. So now when I go to an LP in the US and raise money, He says, you pay what? You mean it's going to cost me more to be in your fund than to be in a comparable U.S. fund? I'm going to pay this surcharge? So those are challenges, right? And that's unintended consequences. You think on the one hand harmonizing makes it better? It hasn't. It's made it worse. I'm now paying millions of dollars more out, and my returns go down as a function of that. So when I compete against the U.S. peer who did exactly the same thing as me, my returns are lower.
Okay, thank you. And Sandra, maybe you can pick up on this question. I was going to actually talk about access to capital, and rather than put Alan on the spot, I love doing it, but I'll give him a break this time. So, Sandra, can you give us your view of access to venture capital in Ontario? Is it a big problem, as everybody seems to think it is? And what role, if any, should the government continue to play in that?
Well, that in particular is an issue, as you mentioned, that the government has tried to address. And since 03 that I was at that cabinet table, it's been a perennial subject matter for debate in what do you do, how do you do it? Well, that didn't seem to work. Well, let's try to tweak this. Well, maybe if we could change this. Well, let's get some more people. Who's managing the fund? So it wasn't for lack of wanting to do it, but to your original point, failure is really not an option. You cannot tell the public that you threw $90 million into a fund and you really don't know what happened to it, because, well, they've done that with larger amounts and it hasn't gone very well, you know. So, anyways, are you taping this session? No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, only to say, it really is about that. The risk factor for government is there's a far lower threshold for that than there would be, although, you know, businesses want to be much more anti-risk today than even 10 years ago. And I think, Alan, you mentioned that. The whole world's changed over what businesses are prepared to do. So likewise, it's changed for government too. And there is such an intensity on the transparency theme. Where's the money? What did you do? You want to spin out hydro agencies, by way of a different subject matter, into their own corporation, but you still want the same access points. And they're not the public sector, they're the private sector, but you can't pay them like the private sector, you have to pay them like the public sector, you know. So we're almost, we're of two minds constantly, being buffeted by the politics of it. I have met so many business people now that have just put it all down to, well, that's politics. No, actually, some of it is having a different goal. The goal of business simply isn't the same as the goal of government. The goal of government is a broader, more socialist view, and that's for a conservative government too. It's not political. You know, we're supposed to do things for everybody fairly, and businesses need to do good things for their balance sheet. That is a very different end, and so consequently, everything that leads up to it is going to be different. You find common ground, which is again back to doing that kind of research to say, with what I want, what part of what I want is really good for the government? And that's how you begin that conversation.
So I'd be interested in your comments on, you often hear, should government be picking winners and losers? What's your view on that? In other words, should government be selecting companies to invest in with the taxpayers' money directly, as opposed to an example that Peter talked about, where maybe they fund a venture capital fund and on an arm's length basis, and they make the decisions. What's your view on that?
Well, I think it's changed over time. My view is yes, they should pick clusters that have a bigger impact on the economy. So I'll use the auto example, because every other industry said to me as the minister, well, you gave billions to the auto industry, what about mine? And I would sit back and have a good answer. If yours had as much impact on the broader economy, yes, and yes, they do. So that was an historic moment when that industry had to be bailed out, but it wasn't that different from Bob Ray stepping into the Sioux to help Algoma, because it would have been razed to the ground as a community at that time in the early 90s when Algoma was going down, and Bob Ray stepped in. A lot of flack for doing it, but years later, it's still there, still employing people. So in its own little microcosm there, it was the same story as automotive. I actually believe that there are some that have a ripple effect in a community, and if that's what the government says is its priorities, it should help. So, government has to figure out how to help to be the most effective. Life science is important to the government because the industry hires people that are really smart with a great education and gets paid a lot of money. So that's in the government's best interest to have a strong life sciences cluster. So what does the government need to do to have a strong cluster? Because we want the outcome. right? So you have to put all the pieces in place. Well, in this global world, come and do more clinical trials here so that we get the research piece closer to Ontario so that when you do move to manufacturing, you're already in the zone. So we should do certain things in the clinical trial area, and the government has done that. So, you know, by offering some portion of funding, et cetera. So in a way, it has picked life sciences as a winning cluster. It hasn't, probably could do a better job on the individual company. They try to do these funds that are setting broad criteria, and if you meet these broad criteria, these items, you get the money. But in the end, there will always be some piece of that that is somewhat subjective, which is where the difficulty becomes.
Okay, thank you very much. Maurice, I'd love to get your views on this.
Yeah,
And recognizing you're sitting next to your old boss, so you'll be careful.
yeah,
with
but
your
she's not my boss anymore, so I can still. But the point was made about the government funding venture capital for the ecosystem. I think ecosystem cluster, that's kind of the level at which government policy for support makes sense. I don't think that unless there's other circumstances, you know, helping specific companies is the way to go. But the government has a multiple bottom line. It's not just money. In the private sector, it makes money good, doesn't make money, close it down. That's not the same account that you have to make in the public sector. Is this a one industry town? These people are going to have no other means of making a living. You can't just let it go and disappear. So here's where decision-making in the public sector is so much more complex. There's so many other factors that have to be taken into account. But absolutely, governments have looked at different clusters. Is there going to be a future in life sciences? Of course, you know, that's a cluster to be supported. Information technology as well. And we see that this kind of sustained support, in addition to this framework things that need to happen for business to operate, have in general given good results. Now, but governments do have to do these things for the collective, right? And so if they, to go back to the question about the HST, if that harmonized tax makes sense for the collective of businesses, but for some sectors it doesn't work, again, you know, the government is looking for the good of the general, of the collective.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. Alan?
One of the challenges, so first of all, should government be in venture capital is a whole other matter. I don't think we ought to pick winners and losers. I think that's a very dangerous thing. I was inspired by the entrepreneur that was here that runs the diagnostic business, Shauna, because what she described was coming to the marketplace to fill a need, and the talent was there. So we've done, I think, an exceptional job through our college and university system at training people. If we have the right talent and create an environment, then business will flourish. One of the, I think, sad realities of the moment in which we live is we're all so busy eating our young and tearing each other down. We forgot to realize that we're a relative rounding error to the world, and that we need to find a way of working together a little bit more closely. If you look at the political situation in the province and a minority government, I mean, it's effectively paralyzed. Nobody is taking risk. There's not smart risk taking. We just tear them down. So where business wants to plan on incremental cycles, 3 to 5 years, and you develop a business plan around it, government is reacting by the moment, the hour, the day, and the week, and they're fundamentally not able to align with developing good industrial policy because they're just reacting all the time. So I'm not sure that answers the question necessarily about the raising money. I would say as a final comment on that, there's lots of money. If you have a good idea and you can put together a proper business plan and help people understand the risk and when you're going to get to cash flow, there's lots of money.
Okay, thank you. So, next question. Alan, hang on the mic. There's been a lot of policy discussion around our inability to efficiently commercialize technologies in life sciences. Government often views this as a failure of private sector to make investments and create jobs, and the private sector often criticizes government for investing too much in basic research and not enough in early stage development or applied research. Who's right, or is the issue something completely different? Is there a policy solution?
Well, it's as much culture as anything else. When you think about it, the Ontario government is arguably one of the single largest investors in research in this province. But what we have happening in academic institutions is this wall that has gone up around, and people's inability to want to work. Business and commercialization is nearly a dirty word. And where I think we've gone wrong, and this is an opinion of Alan Odette more than anything else, is this culture that we've created that business ought not to be involved, and that this conversation can't take place with these different parties. What we might want to consider doing in the 21st century is bringing the parties together, as the former minister described, and putting the various stakeholders in a room, dumping the collective objectives in the middle of table, and maybe working on where we have shared alignment to achieving what I would describe as a collective ambition.
Maurice?
I think this is one of the areas where a lack of understanding of the role of basic science and applied science and commercialization has played a role. People don't realize that the basic science for, let's say, wireless communication, it was established in 1898 by James Clerk Maxwell. Don't realize that the lasers that are used today, the original work was done by Einstein in 1932. And it takes a long time for basic science to make it to the shop floor and to make it into a commercializable product. So you have to understand, you have to support basic science, but you cannot expect that you're going to get the results of that in a couple of years. That's not going to happen. And on the other hand, if you're talking about commercialization and to put a lot of the onus on commercialization on the university and going forward, I think it's, in my view, it's misguided. I think that's kind of a technology push. What about having companies look for what are the problems that you need to crack, and what are the technologies that you need to crack those problems, and then go and shop around for the technologies that allow you to do that. That kind of pull model, I think, will work much better for faster commercialization. If you just push and hope that good things will happen at the other end, it will be a long wait.
Okay, Sandra?
That sounded like a nuclear physicist talking there for a moment. Probably most people didn't realize that he was the only nuclear physicist that achieved the level of assistant deputy minister with the government of Ontario, and that's Maurice. I used to tell everybody that at the CETA table, so that would scare the opposition into giving us what we wanted for Ontario. In any event, I think some of this goes, but you mentioned procurement when you started speaking earlier, and I think this is one area where government can be tremendously helpful in these fledgling little companies that have really good ideas. And if you do that pairing right, where you're having the sort of the little explosion of ideas going on inside of a university, and the universities are appropriately linked with business, they help know exactly where to go to try this on for size. And then government can play a role when it can, because it's often the funder. Some of those examples, like medical devices, for example, where if the government is calling a hospital CEO and saying, we'd really like you to try this thing. You know, you buy 100 every year. Could you buy 2 of this kind and see how this works? When you get a call like that from the government, who happens to be the funder, it's amazing how open the hospital is to trying something on when the benefit could be some fledgling little company that just can't get anywhere on this front with a really good idea. Next thing you know, they're able to export their products, being able to say, and by the way, this hospital in Ontario is using this and is on a trial or is in their first successful year of its application. That's very strong language that's actually very helpful, probably didn't cost very much, and it was all about coordination of talking to the right people. Government can make that happen. business can make that happen because our communities are small enough in Ontario. Everybody knows everybody. All the key mucky-mucks in the Ontario life sciences sector knows all the key CEOs of hospitals. They do. They probably haven't called for something in a social nature like that. Be a nice, pleasant phone call to make. I think we don't push ourselves to do what we can actually do, given the role that we have. So we are much more powerful than we think we are to make it happen as a collective, and we just don't take advantage of it. But, I believe, having watched for a long time, people say you really can't do that, and we say, yeah, actually you can do that, and if you put your mind to it, you will do it. I think there's enough smart people in Ontario in this sector that they can help all those fledgling little companies come along. I'm really a strong believer in that, very hopeful that we're actually on the right path that way.
Thank you. Peter?
I think this procurement thing is a huge theme, actually, but I think it bifurcates into two camps. I think, Sandra, you're right when you say the big companies know all those hospital CEOs. They absolutely do. They have 40 people on staff who are doing government relations, who are talking to government, who are talking to the big hospitals, but the small companies don't. And in fact, their access to those hospitals is very limited. Their ability to engage with the clinicians in those hospitals is very limited. And so you got to figure that out. But I do think there is an opportunity to use procurement as a really fundamental tool, and I think you got to think about it in two silos. I think there's an opportunity for a quadruple bottom line kind of win. Local companies, local innovation equals local jobs. And I think the spending on science R&D is about more than just fundamental science. It's about engaging high-value jobs, high-value clinicians in our community, because that drives much more than just the dollar you spend on the science. But the quadruple bottom line is local jobs, local innovation, driving down costs of healthcare and hopefully increasing patient outcomes and creating better work environments for our caregivers. So maybe it's even more than quadruple bottom line. And I think that opportunity absolutely exists. The Ontario government, I think, has just done something really innovative, which is the OHIC Council, which is putting together the Ministry of Innovation and the Ministry of Health, trying to look at procurement as a tool. And I cheer them for doing that. I think that's a very challenging thing to do because there are obviously two completely different drivers there in terms of what gets them up in the morning. I think working through the challenge of what a big company wants out of that relationship and what a small company needs out of that relationship is going to be the challenge for the council. But I'm encouraged because I think procurement is a big tool. I think if you look at, the fact that we have one HMO, I think as Tom said earlier, that HMO recognizing that they can enable, you think about a company like Novidac, it took 200 orders from people outside of this province before the province bought one of the Novidac systems. That's not right. I mean, that was a good technology, that's sad. And now that's a big company, billion-dollar, market cap. We have to figure out how we do exactly what you said, which is, put in place in the context of many, in a much bigger budget, a few things that enable that company to say, I am at Sick Kids, or I am at UHN. Here's the data that I've pulled out of that. Here's the outcomes and the benefits we've had. That will give them leverage in the broader marketplace.
Thank you.
Comment,
So I'm sensitive to the time here, so I got one more question, and then we'll turn it over to the floor.
I was just going to...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just
Go ahead,
a small comment on, there's a lot of play on local things, and some of them work, some of them don't. I don't think innovation, science, and business are global today. It's nice to have a local notoriety in some areas, but if you're not really at an international level, then you don't really have top science or top innovation. Mm-hmm. And today, business is also, global. And the other thing is that local preference to local companies is just not allowed under the WTO, the World Trade Organization rules. So, we're going to run into trouble with that as well. That's not to say that procurement cannot be used. There are smart ways of doing it, but I have to be careful with those two.
Okay, thanks. Al, any closing comments on that issue?
No, I would. It's been said. We have the largest HMO ever, and we're a small community. And if we got smart and figured out how we might want to work together, wow, like we could rock in Ontario, and we're going to, because I think the next generation will probably figure it out when we get past this party politic that goes on now. The next generation, when they wake up, and they haven't come alive yet, I see them a lot, the culture will change. Fundamentally, it will change.
I think this requires tolerance for failure, and if requires also a license, a social license for government not to go for the absolutely cheapest solution, right? And we are now requiring that it's got to be the cheapest solution.
I was just going to say that we've got it's sort of two minds. So depending on if finance is at the table or not, because that has driven a lot of the back office activity in hospitals and the big buy conglomerate, both on the school boards for education, the hospitals. That's really hard for a little company to break through. And we learned that, and that's what we heard through this Open for Business, which is how this link now, there was Saad Rafi, the deputy at health, sitting there thinking, well, we can actually do that. And that was just a function of having the right guy at the table for the right conversation with the right business people, understanding you really can do this. And so that's why I am hopeful, because I watched some of this transpire, that it did become a way to get around it. And keep in mind, trade agree. Everyone always says, well, you can't do that because. So we used to have a joke that never say in this office, you can't do this because. Right? You really have to say, how do we get around this? Because we recognize it's an issue, and you do have to deal with it carefully, and it is complex when you're in a global marketplace for these companies, which they are. So respecting that, you can always use words like pilot, sample, trial.
I like you.
See? And you can do that.
I know. At OCE, we say there's nothing longer than a government pilot program. And we're happy to receive them all the time. Thank you very much. So. Okay, so we're going to move on. One more question, and then we'll turn it over to the floor. And Sandra's going to love this one, I think. If you were Premier tomorrow and had an opportunity to champion one significant policy initiative that would positively impact Ontario life sciences sector, what would it be? Whoever wants to start. Yeah. Keep it down to an hour.
I'll start, and I won't say something I've said before, because I think there's a bunch of important themes that I would focus on. I would actually put in place an angel tax credit. I think engaging angel investors and providing economics incentives, and I don't think that angel tax credit has to be actually the same for all sectors. You can skew the credit to the behaviors you want to enforce, and you think the things that reinforce your priorities as a government. And so you can have one tax credit for investing in life sciences, and you can have another one for investing in ITC. And I think engaging entrepreneurs and capital as mentors, partners, very early on, and giving them an economic incentive to stay in the game is really important.
Okay, thank you. Sandra. Oh, Alan, I'm sorry. Let Alan go. He's fighting the chump here.
So I don't know whether it would be in a role as a politician or a premier, but if I could wave a wand, what could significantly add to our strategic competitiveness as a region is people working together. And we heard from the Sarah from Bio, that could be our most significant competitive advantage. That organizations from large enterprise through to small enterprise, from associations, government, et cetera, figure out just frankly how small we are, but how powerful we could be if we were working together. That we're not competing against each other, and that we could, by raising the water table, float everyone's boat a little bit higher. And for some reason, I can't figure out why people can't come to that same conclusion. You need only go beyond the border of Ontario and Canada, in the United States or Europe or in China, wherever, to recognize fundamentally what our real strength is. And it's our it's our size, and frankly, the smallness of our community that could be our absolute strength.
Thank you. Maurice.
Well, actually, I didn't have to or become premier to get my pet idea implemented, which is great. And considering everything else that comes with the job, right? But I've been pushing for a long time the idea that we can have a voucher for companies to get R&D done. So give a voucher to a company, now the company's in the driver's seat. They can go buy the R&D from any university in the land they want. And that gets around this commercialization question that we had before. And so lo and behold, when I was in charge of the Secretariat to the Premier's Jobs and Prosperity Council, I mentioned this idea to the group doing innovation. They said, great, we'll put it in the report. They put it in the report, and now it's a reality. So like I said, didn't have to become premier to get that idea.
Thank you. I must tell you, OCE has been very pleased to deliver that program. Sandra, everybody's waiting with bated breath here to see what you have to
No,
say.
maybe I should have been on that council. It'd have been a lot cheaper for me than trying to become the premier. That was a joke. Anyway,
Paid off yet?
thankfully, it was a lot of your money,
No more
the business
fundraisers,
community.
right?
No, I'm just done. I actually had to give money back, which is
Good problem, Dan.
historic in a leadership campaign, imagine. In any event, I would say that maybe my view is a little different because I was in Brussels pitching to a big life sciences company and recognizing what our competition looks like out there. And you know, whether it was Chicago at a headquarters there and understanding what that world looks like, I would go down the route that we had the benefit, as industry minister, we created that Next Generation Jobs Fund. We expanded it to include many sectors. I would probably do an exclusive for life sciences because the word gets out very quickly in a very tight-knit community that is global, and they will know we are on the map for investment. Our own provinces in Canada do this and have us for lunch, and I just can't bear it. And it's very generational in this industry. Once you miss, for that big company, if you miss that cycle of investment, you don't even talk to them again for 10 years. You know, it's the nature of this beast here. You know what the pipeline looks like when the pipeline's going dry, what drugs are about to come out, you know? And it's that kind of a cyclical business in life sciences that you have to be ready with the right tools to strike when that company's ready. And if you don't have that, it's gone. And the whole world is waking up. You know, Singapore wants a cluster. They get a cluster. You know, the competition for us, you can send a pill a lot of places with not that much expense, and we need to see that. And I wish that more, I wish that instead of moving cabinet, say, to the north, just to see what it's like up there, we should go to another country so we could see what the real competition is like in economic development. And I did get that chance to see that. So I was always dismayed that there isn't a broader understanding in government at multiple levels of decision making at how competitive it is. And our guys, our local CEOs that we expect to go to bat to their headquarters, and they say, well, what can I tell them? What can I tell them that we'll do for them? And then you guys sit there and say, we're really charming people. We're very charming here, you know. And because by comparison, they're saying, wow, this state's given us this much in tax abatement for 20 years, and, you know, all this, and the list goes on. And next thing you know, we lose these generational investments. And to me, that is really, really difficult to watch. And I expect a premier to have a jobs person in the premier's office exclusively for that purpose, because you can't talk about great education or social services if your economy is not flying, right? So.
Okay, thank you. So, questions from the floor. Feel free, don't be shy.
We had a question this morning, which I thought was germane to this discussion, and it sort of got missed, I think. And the story was, you know, if someone comes into a hospital with a product that's going to cost $5,000 more than what they're currently using to have sort of the same results within there, but it may have an $80,000 positive impact elsewhere, that doesn't get caught because it's within the silo of the hospital. So that comes down to procurement and job production. How do we get around that type of scenario?
I'm not sure I understand the question fully. So the product costs more, but it generates savings somewhere else?
No, the product may cost and I use these numbers broadly, like it may cost X at the particular institution, but there may be an X plus however much more on the community effort. But because the hospital has to deal with an individual budget, it can't say, yeah, we will take that product on because that impacts our budget, even though it may have a community benefit.
Yeah, if I may, just on this, because this is when you hear stories like this, when you're in a smaller region, it's actually easier to manage these things. So the government created these local health integrated networks, 14 across Ontario, for the express purpose of being able to move down some powerful level of decision-making that didn't exist before, where the DHCs, the original people who've been around a long time in health will probably remember DHCs, that was a public policy kind of a body, but not decision-making. Its next generation really were these LHINs. And I have examples in my hometown where the hospital savings were affected because we spent a little bit more in the community, for example. So the reverse of this story, but the same concept. So we could actually have a community health organization delivering mental health that took the people out of the emergency room in that local hospital. And so they're able to, through the LHIN network, move money around to make that happen, take a little bit of money and give it to the mental health agency that showed a dramatic increase and targeted, and you could see the accountability of the money, how much saving and how many fewer visits in the ER there was that validated the little bit of expense on the other side. That's a lot easier to do in a community whose LHIN includes Windsor, Essex, Chatham, Kent, Sarnia, Lambton, I think that's the whole LHIN. So it's harder in other bigger centers for sure, but that's exactly why that governance structure was changed in the Ministry of Health, was to be able to do this easier. Other examples, we actually took money from the hospital budget, carved it out, and moved the beds, physically moved the beds into a children's agency. And the kids who you wouldn't want to go into the hospital with these issues but needed residential, basically, got the money moved. So it is not impossible, it can happen. The other solution, which is more complicated, is letting the organizations keep the money they don't spend at year end. That would be a very high-risk strategy for the government, but it would allow, if you gave that decision-making to each independent agency, you would say, okay, so you saved 100 grand this year. What would ordinarily happen, and still does, is this massive spend before March 31st, stupidly, half the time.
Next year budget.
Right, that's right. So you don't have to give it back to the government, which is what they're always cursed with, but just let them dump it in the next one. So it forces them to think that way, to say, no, I could actually do that, and in 5 years I can afford that new wing of the blah, blah, blah. So that is a solution the finance absolutely doesn't like. But if it were better times, they should try a pilot of that. Listen, I tried to sell that, but as ComSoc minister, because that was really rampant in that sector, and it was very difficult, but it really is a mindset that you would change, not to waste a whole bunch of money come March, because you'd have to give it back, and then you start doing smart things when you know you actually get to keep it, because these people, we're assuming that they're children. They're not children. These are expert professional people that lead these organizations, right?
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got any comments on the question?
You know, you could spend a day on this. The system is perverse. Like, I mean, when you really think about it, we don't measure population health outcome, and it's all about budget. And the vast majority of that, if you think about this space, is largely labor. We're measuring the wrong things, to be short.
Maurice, any comments? No? Peter? No? Okay. Other questions from the floor?
Yes, this question's to Maurice. Ontario has a brilliant discovery that's going nowhere. And we heard this morning the governor of Massachusetts, a politician, put forward $1 billion, and 15 projects were signed per year. And what happened, it precipitated success. The venture capital guys got excited, got on the bandwagon. And then Big Pharma came in and said, we'd like to be associated with that. So why can they do it and not you?
Actually, I think that's a question for the politicians. I'm a bureaucrat. But he's good. That speaks to the point that Sandra just made of having, a fund for this sort of thing. When you have an 11 or maybe more by their accounts $1 billion deficit, it becomes tough to say we're going to spend, $1 billion doing this, etc. And while you still have health eating up half of the budget, and you have other programs that you want to roll out because it's in your platform.
You know what I find amazing is that Massachusetts feels they need to do that. It is a really good story all by itself because they're worried that everybody's having their lunch. And in essence, they see what we see here, that all of a sudden, all of these countries in the world suddenly wake up and decide, we're going to have a new sector. Oh, let's pick life sciences, and they throw a ton of money at it that we can't compete with. You know, there's a state within the Middle East that woke up one day and decided they're going to have an automotive cluster. An automotive cluster. I mean, really. It's just, and they have the wherewithal to do it because ultimately, if companies are going to look for, various incentives to land something that they could notionally at least make anywhere, I suppose it could happen. But if Massachusetts has to come out with $1 billion fund, Massachusetts is worried about its sector and its cluster because ordinarily, what is around that cluster in that area between the academia, the companies, the startup mentality, the entrepreneurialism, it shouldn't need any help from government, but apparently it does. So I actually see that as a bit of a good news story. When we were doing this Aerospace Council last year, and we were traveling looking at how aerospace, is helped or hurt by government, France had just undertaken this massive review of their aerospace industry because they were so worried. Well, the rest of us around the world in that cluster look at that and say, oh my God, if only we had France. Well, here France is worried because everyone's chomping at the bit to take pieces of their industry. So, only to say that the fact that Massachusetts does step forward in this manner tells you how competitive and fierce it is out there for cyclical investments by big companies. And if Ontario's not playing in that game, I'm telling you, we don't have that opportunity to let our CEOs from Canada pitch Canada. And that's what they need to be able to do.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got comments on that? Okay, next question.
Here. Hello? Oh, sorry. Were you waiting? Do you want to go ahead? Oh, thank you. I didn't know. Were you standing?
For a while, but that's okay.
You go ahead, because I was
Good
sitting there.
exercise. Oh my goodness. Thanks. My question relates to technology startups and a contradiction that exists between SR&ED tax credit program, public policy, and private lenders. The SR&ED tax credit program is essential to technology startups. It provides the kind of money that is needed to pay salaries, to hire people, and to also pay back lenders who are also exceptionally essential to the tech startup ecosystem. The lenders will lend based on expected projected cash flow, and of which a substantial portion is expected to come from SR&ED tax credits. The contradiction is this. Once a technology startup makes its first sale, it can no longer rely on those SR&ED tax credits to be able to pay back what might be substantial sums to its lenders. And it would make sense for a technology startup not to want to delay first sale as long as possible. This is a commercialization contradiction. The SR&ED tax credit system is a national program, but Ontario has the largest number of technology startups in Canada. This contradiction threatens to undermine the substantial and very positive investments that we're making in Ontario to grow our innovation economy. And my question is perhaps food for thought. What can we do in Ontario to mitigate the risk of this contradiction between the SR&ED tax credit program and private lenders?
Peter?
Well, so I think the first part of I'm not sure 100% of your thesis is correct because you can continue to get shreds if you continue to innovate. You can't continue to get shreds if you don't continue to innovate. And since most technology companies continue to innovate, you can continue to get shreds. So I think that you have to be careful how you think about that. But more importantly, I think there's a philosophical problem with your question, which is, are you in the business of getting government grants or are you in the business of building a business? And no entrepreneur that I have ever met who is committed to building a real business would ever delay launching his product, getting customer feedback, getting traction, getting insight, building customer relationships to get a modest amount of handout money. And I'm a big supporter of shreds, huge supporter. But I don't believe any world-class entrepreneur would ever do that. I don't think there is any misalignment there. We have never, ever once had a debate in any of our firms about delaying commercial strategies to get shreds. We do have lots of conversations about how we get non-dilutive capital, where do we get that capital from, how do we use it effectively, and if you look at our companies on average raise 5 times as much non-dilutive capital as they do, our kind of money, and they need to do that. But we never have that conversation. So I'm not sure the issue exists in the way you framed it.
Any other comments? Okay, next question.
Carol Culhane. My question is directed towards Maurice, but if any of the other panelists could also answer, that would be great. I participated in a think tank session over the U.S. Thanksgiving weekend, and some people were saying that a lot of the technology from Star Trek of the 60s has been achieved. We have diagnostic imaging, space stations for fueling. Google launched their driver-free car, and Amazon recently said that, these deliveries that would be like a one-off airplane. So that was 50 years ago. Would you agree that it's going to take another 50 years for fundamental technology to be commercialized now, today, at the pace? And if not, why not?
Well, I think, fortunately, it will not take another 50 years. I think that the pace of change and commercialization is increased. So actually, if you look at the time that it took for wireless technologies to be developed from electromagnetism, and you look at how long it took for the CCD, for example, the charge couple device to be at the heart of every video camera, that only took about 25 years. So I think as change accelerates, time to market gets shorter and shorter and shorter. But it still, I think, is significant. I think that if people represent to politicians that they're going to have jobs out of this in a couple of years, that's not going to happen, and that's the danger that I've seen.
Thank you.
I think the pace of, well, maybe I can just speak. I think the pace of fundamental innovation is accelerating. If you look at what it cost to sequence the genome 20 years ago or 10 years ago, and what that was, if you look at what it costs to do that today, it's a fraction of that number. And I think that has changed how all of those molecular diagnostic technologies are getting embodied into the ecosystem, and we're seeing that in every phase of our business. Robotic surgery didn't exist 15 years ago. Today it's standard of care. So I'm excited about the pace of innovation adoption. We're really excited about the pace of change. I think it's getting faster.
Thank you. Any other comments? Questions, anybody? Okay, well, thank you all for being here today. Thank you very much for your attendance, and especially at this session. I hope you found it informative, and please, if you could offer up a round of applause for our panel. Thank you very much. Oh, do you?
All right, thank you very much. That was great. I really enjoyed that panel. Actually, I really enjoyed the whole day. I'm over the moon. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Jason Field. I'm the Executive Director of Life Sciences Ontario. John, I just want to acknowledge Dr. John Kelly. John, stand up for a moment. John is the chair of the organizing committee of this event. John, congratulations. It's a terrific event, and we had lots of volunteers. If our committee members of our organizing committee could please stand. Benny, I know you were part of that. Others in the room from our committee, Matt. And thank you very much. And Sue and Brian, you've met Sue and Brian. Brian's manning the the AV here right now. It's my dubious honor to summarize the day. I'm going to do this fairly quickly. I know that I'm standing between you and the bar, so I'm not going to take long. You know, the theme of today, this idea of catalyzing collisions and clusters, has a unique meaning for me. We heard Maurice talk a little bit from a scientist's view, and when I hear catalyzing collisions and clusters as a scientist, I have certain things that run through my head. Obviously, I'm a chemist by training, and collisions in creating clusters, I think about it from molecules coming together. And catalysis is the process by which you reduce barriers, energy barriers. So you're facilitating change. And that's really the essence of what we wanted to get to today. How can we start a discussion that will facilitate change? And you know, we've talked today about all the strengths and assets that we have in Ontario. We've seen the best practices in other jurisdictions, and it's becoming more and more evident to me that we do have all the pieces of the puzzle right here in Ontario, and we need to put it together. And we've explored all the players in terms of direction of our advocacy to government, the role of government, and our understanding of the role of government. We've explored targeting different audiences for our advocacy, the public, and their understanding of our industry and the socioeconomic benefits of our industry. So, you know, all of these things have to come together, but the onus is on us, right? We can't wait for government to do it for us because it's not their role to do it for us. This is something that we need to own as a sector here in Ontario. And this is the role that Life Sciences Ontario, it's the reason we exist, right? It's my job day in and day out is to try to build these bridges, and there was a great term that David Wolf used, boundary-spanning bridge builders. I think that is a role that we need to identify champions within this sector to be those boundary-spanning bridge builders. So I want to challenge each and every one of you. I think Sandra had a great comment today that we don't know our own power. We need to be empowered as individuals in terms of what we can do and the message that we can carry with us. So my challenge to you as you leave here today is to be champions for this sector, to build those bridges and those collaborative efforts. I know I'm probably not summarizing the session, but I'm talking about what I heard today from these various communities. The essence of it comes down to collaboration and the willingness to collaborate. And again, the onus is on all of us to do that and be open to those collaborations. So I want to thank you all very much for participating today. I think this was a great start of this conversation. We are going to have a summary, a written summary document that will come out of this with some key findings and recommendations. So it'll do a much better job than I did of summarizing the whole day that we had today. So thank you again, and a reminder that there is a draw. We're going to do it right now. Okay, Carol, do you have the... Oh, that's a great idea. Sandra, can you pull a name out of a box? Oh, Sandra just said she doesn't want to pick winners and losers. It's a pilot draw. Syngenta? Nancy Tout. Is Nancy still here? She's gone. Okay. That's okay. She's on our board, so she's disqualified. Benny, we loaded this up. Benny, go ahead. You deserve it, sir. Congratulations, Benny. All right. Please stick around. We've got some great networking. At the back of your badge, there's a little ticket, so that's the first drinks on us. Thanks for joining us tonight.